One thing I loved about being a Sega Genesis owner was its incredible evolution from launch games to the stuff we saw years later. As developers become more familiar with the hardware and the size of cartridges increased, Genesis games remained visually impressive well into its life. The Super Nintendo is often lauded for its better color palette in many titles, but considering the Genesis was on the market 2 years before that system even showed up, I can't help but still be impressed by its later life software. And that's what we are doing here today. We are going to take a look at some Genesis games that really had some impressive visual effects. This group of software were often doing things most people said couldn't be done on the hardware. Some of these effects are so impressive we wouldn't see its normalization until the 32-bit generation showed up. I hope you guys enjoy great visual effects on the Sega Genesis. Aside from being a unique run-and-gun shooter, Ranger X here has some killer special effects. Right from the first stage, you are greeted with large, well-animated sprites, great color, and detailed backgrounds. But what made this game such a stunner were the stages that employed pseudo-3D elements. A few stages had great scrolling effects that gave it almost a 2.5D feeling long before the term was coined. So convincing and impressive was this, I remember just running back and forth for minutes on end just to see it in action. Other stages also had some great effects with lighting. There is a forest stage that is dark while you are under the tree line and then brightens up in the sun when you fly higher. There was also some cool water effects and other stages that employed even more 3D style perspectives in the backdrops. I mean, look at that! It's hard to imagine home hardware from 1988 was still capable of doing this 5 years after the fact. Ranger X was released in every major region, so there is no excuse not to have a go at this visually stunning title. Sometimes a game could be incredibly impressive just considering its scale and the sum of everything that you had going on at one time. Thunder Force 4 is one such game. Stages covered a huge vertical play area of scrolling despite being a horizontal shooter. The playfield was so massive, you often had different elements happening at the top and bottom. Sometimes you just had a stage that assaulted your eyes with great color and tons of parallax scrolling. And sometimes you just got a stage so mind-blowing, it looked like it belonged on the Neo Geo. Again, many of these effects carried with it a feeling of 3D space and depth, which I don't think I need to impress upon you how cool it was to have this in the time before mainstream polygons. Add to the mix some huge boss encounters and a killer soundtrack, and Thunder Force 4 was one heck of an impressive game on Sega's 16-bit Warhorse. Throughout the 1980s, sprite scaling in the arcade became a huge deal, particularly when it came to Sega games. It was an effect you didn't often see done well on home systems, which is exactly why 1994's Panorama Cotton was so impressive. This is your base Mega Drive hardware in action. No additional chips tucked away in the cartridge, no add-on devices that look like mushrooms, just the Mega Drive itself. Whereas even Sega had a hard time doing convincing software scaling on its own hardware, developer success nails it like it's running on some high-end arcade board. Sprites, backgrounds, and other stage elements all move fluidly and fast as you play through its many areas. It even changes the visual stylings of these areas frequently. The level of polish to this engine impresses me each and every time I play it, and remains one of the platform's true standouts. And if that wasn't enough, it also happens to have some great music with it as well. Treasure games were often great looking and sounding pieces of software. An episode like this could be loaded with stuff just from them, but here I want to focus on their alien soldier. Released in 1995, this is likely a game most of you missed back when it was released, thanks to the interest in newer hardware. But boy was it a looker. Massive sprites, great color use, huge multi-jointed sprites, and some killer background effects totaled up to a game that was truly impressive visually. The gameplay amounts to little more than a glorified boss rush, but I don't think anyone can argue that it wasn't a heck of a good-looking title. This was never released in the US physically, so I guess there are many out there that still haven't played it. It's hard, fast, and likely to make you bust up a controller or two, but your eyes will appreciate it all along the way. Another super late 1995 release was The Adventures of Batman and Robin. This was a side-scrolling run-and-gun that featured two-player co-op. While it was a pretty solid effort overall, it was the visual elements that truly set it apart. Right from the first stage, you get incredibly well-animated sprites, a great 3D effect on the scrolling background, and sprites that appear to have some degree of scaling to them. If the game stopped there, you likely would come away impressed, but it just kept on going with vehicle stages that included even more great-looking backgrounds loaded with more depth. The buildings here look 3D and the street below looks like it's way off in the distance. Things of course just keep on coming. More great-looking scrolling effects, large boss battles, and more cool sprite tricks that give the impression the Genesis can manipulate this stuff in hardware effortlessly. Right to the very end, it impresses like few games could. Most of you likely know 1994's Contra Hardcore pretty well. The series has been a staple of most gamers' diets since the NES titles, and after the impressive Super Nintendo release showed up, Konami had their hands full trying to come up with something just as impressive on the Genesis. But boy did they do just that, and this game is nothing short of a visual stunner. Aside from the usually impressive things like huge enemies and great animation, this game does all kinds of cool tricks to simulate scaling, rotation, and just looking cool as hell in general. Animation is a big part of this game's appeal. The large enemies are often multi-jointed and move around smooth as butter. Add in some impressive set pieces and you have a visual style and presentation you just gotta be impressed by. The Sega Genesis is often critiqued pretty hard when it comes to on-screen color. Of the systems released in its day, it had the lowest on-screen color of any of the available hardware. You felt it in most arcade ports too, but in 1992 Sunsoft released Super Fantasy Zone, a title that just didn't burst through the Genesis color barrier, but one that put the arcade game on which it's inspired to shame. This looks like some of the more colorful games on the PC Engine as opposed to what you normally see on the Mega Drive. Not just content on making it colorful, Sunsoft also loaded it with some nice parallax scrolling and some really nice music to shoot along to. Fantasy Zone has a number of games in the series that look great, but this one is my favorite both in gameplay and presentation. The Mega Drive really outdid itself here. The mid-90s saw a pile of games using pre-rendered sprites, backgrounds, and animations, and the Genesis got its fair share. Blue Sky Software set out to make the aging Genesis, now 7 years old by 1995, impress you all over again with what it was capable of. While I have a bunch of issues with Vector Man's stage design and bevy of cheap deaths, I cannot deny the things it does visually. The main character is composed of multi-jointed sprites that are animated incredibly well, and from there, you get tons of great looking backgrounds, special effects, and some pretty nice animations across all of it. Some stages have some killer lighting and transparency work, while others are just impressive because of the animation and great feeling of depth. Vector Man 2 was impressive itself, but I always thought the first one was a better show-off piece. You knew Redzone would be here. I mean, the game right off the bat tells you it does some impressive effects. It's a mixed genre game that uses an overhead multi-directional shooter to segment into its overhead run and gun sections. Both of these engines has some impressive depth, but it's the run and gun areas that are mind-blowing. I mean, look at this. It looks like the Genesis is genuinely pulling off a 3D environment here. The walls, furniture, and doorways all have an incredible 3D feel to them. The gameplay takes a lot of getting used to, and the difficulty can turn away the average gamer looking to explore its design. But for those of you that do, you'll find a game with a truly unique feel that sets it apart on hardware that was never designed to do any of this. In 1996, the Genesis was long dead in the US, yet walking into Sears one fine spring day, I saw the impressive Toy Story running on a demo unit. It looked great in terms of animation, and I loved the way the backgrounds looked slightly 3D. Of course, I had no clue just how far this engine pushed the hardware until years later when I played deep enough to see the later levels. There is a driving engine here that is far smoother than the vast majority of similar games for the platform, and it even has a first-person engine that makes you think the Genesis might have been able to pull off Doom without any extra hardware chips. Traveler's Tales was behind development, and they would go on to make the Sega Saturn do things in Sonic R that was quite impressive as well. I have been looking for a way to cover our next game for years, and I finally get my chance here. Femina Run, or Femina Run as I used to call it, is a forward-scrolling shooter that absolutely floored me in 1991. This engine was exceptional in its execution, particularly since most games you were seeing at that point that scrolled forward were choppy messes that looked nowhere near as nice as the arcade games in the same genre. The scrolling of the waves, the scaling of the enemies and NPCs, and even the way the land masses came into view, this was one great looking title. The gameplay was kind of funky and it could be hard as all get out, but I kept at it almost exclusively for its visuals. The company behind the project, Microsmiths, was also developing the Sega Genesis version of Swamp Thing before it was cancelled.
Come in.
With all due respect to my cousins across the pond, I never found European-developed games to be very appealing. Every so often one would come along and blow me away, however, and Mega Turrican was definitely in that camp. Right from the moment it boots up, you know it's going to be something special. Perfect scaling Sega logo and crystal clear speech introduces the game's logo. From there you get loads of stuff on the screen that never seems to make it slow down at all. Enemies have some nice rotation and scaling style effects, and the grappling arm that your main character uses is animated impressively. It even uses that pixelation effect you see in some Super Nintendo games. All in all, it's a heck of a good game both in its presentation and its gameplay. If the developers had given you the ability to shoot in multiple directions, I believe it would be as fondly remembered as any of the Contra titles. That brings us to the end of what was an episode loaded with great-looking Genesis titles. This by no means was a comprehensive list of every good-looking piece of software, and we certainly could visit this topic again with a brand new list of favorites. Many people love to compare the Genesis to other 16-bit systems of the era, often taking joy in pointing out its weaknesses. But the brilliance of its design didn't rest in any form of specialized hardware, but rather the power afforded to developers by its extremely popular and well-known CPU, the Motorola 68000. Software developers were familiar with it from arcade and home PCs that had been around for years, which allowed them to write some pretty impressive engines for it. In a way, the Genesis was the antithesis to the Saturn. Whereas Sega's 32-bit design relied on lots of proprietary chips and a complicated architecture, the Genesis was simply off-the-shelf parts surrounding a well-known and loved CPU that was already in tons of devices. This allowed the Genesis to have an incredibly long and storied life full of impressive software that often did things the hardware had no higher function to pull off. Yet developer familiarity and know-how proved to be the great equalizer that made it a winner. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.